Hey folks! Today I want to talk fashion with you, or more specifically, two fashion-related exhibits that I've been to recently. Last month I was lucky enough to visit not only Vancouver, but also New York City for the first time. And while I was in both of these cities, I was able to visit two different exhibitions, namely Women Dressing Women at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and Dressed for History, Why Do Costume Collections Matter at the Museum of Vancouver. It was a complete fluke that both of these institutions had a fashion-related exhibit on while I was visiting, and I thought it would be fun to do a little compare and contrast, see what I liked and didn't like about these exhibitions all in one video. One of these exhibitions was a high fashion spectacle that still fell a little bit short, and the other one made me wish that the trillions of microplastics created through the textile industry would just hurry up and kill me already. But hey, my name is Christia, and on this channel I talk about niche historical topics and museums. So if that is your thing, consider sticking around. So as I mentioned, last month I went to New York City for the first time and I dragged my mom along. We had a grand old time. However, my mother is cruel and unusual and she said that we only had time to visit one museum. So I decided to go for the big one, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, otherwise known as the Met. During the initial part of our visit to the Met, I have to admit that I was horrifically hungover because somehow my mother and I ended up at a drag bar at 11:30 on a Sunday night while in New York City. And so while we went through these different wings, I was feeling a little bit under the weather. But I was rejuvenated by a breakfast and a cup of coffee in one of the museum's cafes. This looks like a decent meal, but almost everything pictured here had the composition and flavor of sawdust. Subscribe for more cafe museum reviews. Despite the terrible meal, I was rejuvenated by that delicious cup of coffee, and we went through the various wings of the Met. And I was pleasantly surprised to see that the Met Costume Institute had an exhibition on titled Women Dressing Women. This exhibition was glitzy, it was glamorous, it had a compelling story to tell, but it wasn't quite a 10 out of 10 for me. According to the Met's website, the Costume Institute's Fall 2023 exhibition will explore the creativity and artistic legacy of women fashion designers from the Met's permanent collection, tracing a lineage of makers from the turn of the 20th century to the present day by highlighting celebrated designers, new voices, and forgotten histories alike. One of the first things that I want to point out is that I really liked the layout of this exhibition because it was quite unexpectedly crowded for a Monday afternoon, but it seemed like the designers kind of anticipated this. So all of the mannequins with the beautiful clothing on it was quite elevated, so even if there were multiple people in front of you, you could still see the piece quite clearly. They also had some really nice music playing throughout this exhibition, and maybe it's because I don't go to enough art galleries, but this was kind of new to me and I actually really liked it. It was very calming. One of my goals for 2024 is to go to more art galleries though. This exhibition had several large panels as well as several more smaller panels, and they each served a different purpose. The larger panels described overarching themes and motifs, while smaller panels accompanied the items on display and were used for more in-depth discussions of individual designers or generations of designers. I wasn't able to read many of these smaller panels because, as I mentioned, it was quite crowded and they were down low in front of the different garments. And the few that I did read I thought were a little bit long-winded, and I feel like they could have been a little bit more succinct, a little bit more pared down. There were the small panels, and of course there were the larger ones, and this is where the overarching story, the overarching themes were being explored, and each of these larger ones had a title. Anonymity, visibility, agency, and absence/omission. In the first panel, we are introduced to the female tailor in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, as the right of women to dress women was a slowly earned privilege. This panel also discusses the rise of labels on clothing with the rise of the couture fashion house, and also discusses the fact that a garment was generally not constructed by just the named designer, but also by a number of anonymous workers. textile and mill workers, embroiderers, and seamstresses, and how women have historically been at the heart of these anonymous trades. The second and third panels, visibility and agency, continue with that history lesson, discussing how the interwar period in France allowed many people on the lower rungs of the couture house food chain to rise through the ranks, how women began to exercise their newfound agency in the 20th century, and how the boutique culture that flourished in the 1960s and 70s was primarily led by designers like Vivienne Westwood, Betsy Johnson, Sonia Rykiel, who, quote, imbued their work with progressive, artistic, social, and political ideas. Within the cultivated spaces of these boutique shops, fashion empowered women as both producers and consumers. The final of those 4 large panels, which was absence/omission, was very self-reflective and identified many flaws within the museum and the Met Costume Institute's own collection. Such lapses can take many forms, from missing maker attributions to the lack of extant objects, to poor record keeping, to the prioritization of established narratives. The pieces that survive and enter museum collections typically reflect elite modes of production and consumption, and are prized for their craftsmanship and prestige over notions of cultural resonance and meaning. So now that we've gone through these larger panels, I have a few critiques. First of all, they were in a very academic style of writing, and as I mentioned, it was very crowded in that space, so I did end up taking pictures on my phone of all of the panels so I could revisit them later in my hotel room and while I was writing the notes for the script, and just to really kind of dive into what this exhibition was trying to say. However, even with that extra time, even looking at them, back in my hotel room, I still found this quite dense for a museum exhibition that was going to be viewed by the general public. And before I continue my critiques, I want to just clarify and say that I did enjoy this exhibition, and I liked the story it was trying to tell. However, I wish it cut a little deeper. I really liked the final panel, but that self-reflection that I mentioned earlier felt a little soft. It acknowledged the history of bad record keeping and such, but when it comes to the display of items, I feel like they should have emphasized the prioritization of established narratives more, because it's not just prioritization of narratives, it's also who you're choosing to hire, what objects you're choosing to accession into your collection. It's also who you as an institution are choosing to celebrate. The entire exhibition rings a little hollow when you consider that a few months prior to its launch, there was an exhibition and Met Gala theme that celebrated Karl Lagerfeld, who had some pretty poor opinions on women. I'm going to borrow the words of Elena Demopoulos because I think that she said this best. Likewise, any institution that celebrates Karl Lagerfeld the same year it launches its first all-women exhibit deserves skepticism. Women Dressing Women's co-curator, Melissa Huber, worked on this year's Met Gala, which was dedicated to the late creative director of Chanel. Despite the fact that he was a misogynist who upheld fashion's shameful tradition of thin worship and exploitation of models, the Met produced a mostly uncritical exhibit that doubled as a shrine to the man. Are our institutions finally celebrating women because it's the right thing to do, or because it's trendy? If we can move away from the discussion of the interpretation of women dressing women, I want to speak briefly about the items that were on display. This might be weird, but I really liked the mannequins that accompanied all of the garments in this exhibit, and they looked really cool. In most fashion exhibits, including the one that I saw in Vancouver, the mannequin is just a mount for the garments and the clothing and the accessories to sit on. It helps support the item. But at the Met, they made them a part of the exhibition itself with these headdresses at the crown of each of their heads. It's small and subtle and tied all of these different eras, styles, and body types together, and I really liked it. But speaking of body types, this exhibition was applauded for showing a diverse variety of body types, not just your model thin proportions. They had a mannequin modeling clothing in a wheelchair, another mannequin was a little person, and another was plus size. And as a person of unusual proportions, I'm always happy to see more diverse body types on display. However, of the 30 to 40 mannequins on display, only 3 were a diverse body type. All the rest of them were of the same relative height and stature. And, you know, if I pulled 40 people into a room, 40 femme-presenting people, more than 3 of them would have a diverse body type. And I say femme-presenting people because this type of clothing isn't just worn by cis women. This exhibit, Women Dressing Women, stuck very closely to the gender binary, as if men don't wear dresses and non-binary people just don't exist. Which I find this especially ironic because as I was wrapping up the script notes for this video, the Met Costume Institute actually posted a video to their Instagram that showed many drag queens from RuPaul's Drag Race going through this exhibit and talking about different pieces. And while anyone can be a drag queen, regardless of your gender expression in your day-to-day life, most people who become drag queens are cisgender men wearing, quote, women's clothing. Clothing is a fantastic way of expressing our gender and how we want to be seen. But the clothing itself, the fabric, the buttons, the thread, all of that stuff is genderless. And I really think that we as a society need to move past labeling things as women's clothing and men's clothing. It's just clothing. Personally, my gender swings wildly from Victorian-era librarian with a deadly secret and pirate punk-ass bitch. Although today, I guess I'm rocking a bit more of the art critic, is what I was going for at least. That's up to you to decide if I succeeded or not. Both of these exhibitions that I'm talking about today are displaying, quote, women's clothing, and one was an entire discussion about gender and the fashion industry, yet I feel like the concept of gender and how clothing is so tightly tied into how one represents their gender was completely avoided. Not just in the Met one, but also in the one we're going to talk about in a second. And to give the Met the benefit of the doubt, it was more about the creation of fashion. However, I feel like if they'd cut a little bit deeper, it would have added a really interesting angle to this entire display. Overall, though, not a bad exhibition, not the best. I give it a 6.5 out of 10. A few weeks prior to going to New York City with my dear sweet mother, I went to Vancouver to see the Museum of Vancouver's exhibition, Dressed for History: Why Costume Collections Matter. I was really excited to go to this exhibition because I had seen some pictures on social media from some of my colleagues that had went, and it looked really interesting. I have had the opportunity to work with some really interesting garments and textile pieces in my work as a museum professional, and I really do believe that costume collections do matter because they can tell us so much about not only the person who wore it, but also the period it was manufactured in. If you've been here for a while, you know that I have dipped my toes into discussing fashion history, especially with my wildly contentious video on the peacock dress. This exhibit was pretty much my entire reason for going to Vancouver, except to go and see some friends and eat some delicious food. And so I strolled into the Mauve, expecting to turn my brain off for a little deep dive into fashion history, and for the exhibition to tell me about why I should care about these costume collections. This exhibition is set chronologically, beginning around 1750 with the Rococo period, and ending in the year 2000, so we have about 250 years of fashion on display. And it all started with an introductory panel next to a beautiful dress. Introductory panels are generally the thesis statement of an exhibition. It is the message that the exhibit is trying to say. Clothing is the most personal of artifacts. It reveals so much about who we are and what we do and what we value. Clothing conveys information about occupation, social and economic status, gender and cultural identity, and political and religious affiliation. Clothing not only expresses aspects of a wearer's identity, it also reveals much about the larger context of production. As products of available raw materials, textile technologies, designs, and styles, what we wear connects us to the local and global stories of resource extraction, trade, labor, and technology. Now this is a solid introduction. Not the most well-written, but it tells you what to expect from this exhibition, what sort of discussions are going to be had. I read this and I was stoked. From this introductory paragraph, I expected this exhibition to discuss fashion as a staple of cultural identity, socioeconomic status, and gender. I was also expecting some history of the fashion industry. For example, where did the raw materials come from? How did trade, labor, and political movements affect what was in fashion or on vogue, etc., etc.? Except, the exhibition didn't cover any of that. This exhibition was a massive disappointment. The pieces on display were very pretty, but the interpretation left so much to be desired that it failed to answer its own question. Why do costume collections matter? Just like the exhibition at the Met, there were large panels and there were small panels. A historical costumer or a fashion historian might have been more interested in these panels because it was a very detailed description of the garment on display, but I personally found it extremely dry. This exhibition was broken up by date, chronologically, and each period of fashion was accompanied by a large panel. And this is where this exhibition truly failed. Just like at the Met, this is where the overarching themes and motifs were supposed to be explored. This was where the juicy interpretation was supposed to happen. All of that stuff that they teased about economy and gender in the introduction should have been on these panels. These panels would have been better suited to an exhibit about the development of fashion and style, but that's not what this exhibit was supposed to be about, or at the very least, not how it was marketed. This exhibition is called Why Costume Collections Matter, right? So you should probably be trying to convince me and the other guests why these collections matter. And so I swept through these periods of Rococo, Neoclassicism, the rise of Gothic features, the Empire Revival, World War I, the 1920s, the Great Depression, growing more baffled and frustrated as I went. Just like at the Met, everything here was, quote, women's clothing. It was pretty dresses and shoes and fans and things that most women traditionally wore. Or at least most upper-class women who followed the fashion trends of Europe, not that any of the interpretive panels thought that that was worth mentioning. Maybe the first half of this exhibition title, Dressing for History, was meant to imply that it would all be dresses and therefore, quote, women's clothing, but I honestly think that would be giving these people far too much credit. There was no discussion of gender, no discussion of cultural or religious affiliations outside of Christian European circles, no discussion of class. There was nothing. There is one single panel that tried to do what it set out to do in the introduction. On the panel introducing Neoclassicism, there is a brief mention of colonialism and how it affected the cost and incorporation of certain fabrics into European fashion houses. This one single panel out of nearly a dozen was the only one that tried to say anything meaningful, and it did a terrible job at it. Many of the garments on display are a result of cumulative colonization in Africa and Asia. The dresses made with chintz got that cloth from British India, and the cheap cotton came from American plantations worked by enslaved people. The history of where these fabrics and materials come from is a very interesting and important discussion to have. One I thought that we would be having throughout this exhibition, but this one paragraph on this panel made it feel like an afterthought. By the way, folks, colonialism happened and the horrific trade that enslaved and killed millions of people made cotton cheap. By the way, isn't this dress gorgeous? There was one more reason I took umbrage with this exhibition. I want to talk a little bit about socioeconomic class and how everything on display was for the wealthy. Again, not that the exhibition thought that this was worth mentioning. It was practically fate that I, of all people, walked into this exhibition. And do you want to know why? Well, there was a dress here from Point Ellis House on display. If you haven't been on my channel for very long, the context that you need is that Point Ellis House is a house museum in British Columbia. I was the assistant curator there for 4 years before I was unceremoniously laid off due to the incompetence of our tourism minister. But there was a dress on display in this exhibition that may have come from Point Ellis House. I saw this dress and it made me mad, though not for the reasons that you might think. The first reason is that on the descriptive panel they spelled Point Ellis wrong. A simple Google search would have fixed that. Second of all, while it is unclear if this dress 100% came from Point Ellis House, There is no mention of the women who might have worn it. If we operate under the assumption that this dress did indeed come from Point Ellis House, there are only 2 women who could have potentially worn this dress: Caroline O'Reilly or her daughter, Kathleen O'Reilly. This family was wealthy because Caroline's husband was a man who operated in the upper echelons of the colonial government of British Columbia in the 19th century. He was an Indian Reserve Commissioner for 18 years. He made his wealth by creating a system of reserves that have been used to subjugate and oppress the First Nations people of British Columbia for the last 150 years. If this dress did indeed come from Point Ellis House, that is what paid for the fabric, the thread, the buttons, and the labor that went into creating this dress. But there is no mention of what paid for this dress or who wore it. I feel like the undercurrent of colonialism throughout this entire exhibition would have been a really interesting and important discussion to have, but hey, sparkly dress, am I right? I am so passionate about this because costume collections do matter, and this entire exhibit felt like an excuse for collectors to just show off. And as a result, they missed out on a huge, huge, huge opportunity to be able to talk about why these things matter and the stories that they can tell. In my opinion, this exhibition is a complete and utter failure. They hardly touched on anything in their introduction, and they utterly failed to answer their own thesis question. The items on display were beautiful, but the interpretation was simply descriptive, and by the time I finished walking through this exhibition, I was asking myself, why do costume collections matter? What was the point of any of this? Why should I care? I imagine that many people who went through this exhibition cared less about costume collections than they did when they woke up that morning. I give this exhibition a 2 out of 10. So I brought this video topic up to my friends and I explained my criticisms to them, and one of them said something along the lines of, well, the Met has a lot more money than the Museum of Vancouver. The things that didn't work at the Met all had to do with the interpretation. Meanwhile, at the Museum of Vancouver, it was the interpretation as well, but also the marketing. The Met's interpretation was dense and self-congratulatory, but it was a fine exhibition. Meanwhile, the Museum of Vancouver said it was going to showcase a rich history of fashion, identity, and industry, and instead created a lackluster display of garments completely devoid of any meaningful discussions. When I was working at Point Ellis House and we were doing exhibitions, we always made sure that we had money in the budget for someone to help us with the writing specifically of our interpretive panels, because we needed somebody to help us package our information. We did all of the research ourselves, and then we gave this to the writer, and he made sure that we always were appealing to the demographic that we wanted to appeal to. He made sure that our writing was good and at a level that the general public could find digestible and informative. There were edits and rewrites, and we added things and took things away. We went back and forth with the writer dozens of times before we finally sent those panels to print. And even then, there was often a small typo hidden somewhere in a panel. I don't know what size of budgets these institutions work with, but I know for a fact that it was more than what we were dealing with at Point Ellis House. And so maybe there should have been room in the budget for a writer, and there wasn't. I don't know, and I will probably never know. But oh my god, I can't get over how bad that Museum of Vancouver exhibit was. I'm going to be thinking about that for the next several years. And it's odd because I've reviewed a couple of other exhibits through some short form content on TikTok and here on Shorts on YouTube. And so they have the capacity to put together good exhibitions. I don't know what happened with this one that made it so incredibly bad. But have you been to either of these exhibitions? What would you like to see in a fashion exhibition? What would you have done better? But thank you for hanging out with me until the end of the video. If you really enjoy my content, which I feel like if you've made it this far you do, please consider subscribing. Make sure your notifications are turned on because I have some really cool projects planned for 2024 and I'm going some cool places and I wanted to make sure that you can come with me. Additionally, if you like my content, I do have a coffee account if you want to buy me a coffee. But I hope that wherever you are, you have a wonderful day or evening, and I will see you next time.